Inscryption is a game with many layers to it. However, in one way, I think you can say that Inscryption is a game about games. In fact, this idea is something that even the main characters of the game themselves sometimes argue about. PO3 believes that the most important aspect of any game is its gameplay, its game mechanics, its balance, its strategic depth. Leshy, on the other hand, is all about telling a story. He places an emphasis on the lore of a game over its gameplay. As for me personally, I've always loved both of these two sides of the spectrum equally. There are many games that I play strictly for their gameplay. I love it when a game's mechanics are deep and complex, and I enjoy it when a game is difficult enough that it challenges me to really engage with and master its mechanics, to really push my knowledge and skill to their limits. On the other hand, I've always been fascinated by the potential for storytelling that games have. I love thinking about and analyzing the many ways in which gameplay and narrative interact within games in order to create unique stories that would simply be impossible to achieve in any other medium. And above all, I love it when a game comes along that manages to shatter any preconceptions that I might have had about what is possible to do within the scope of video games as vessels for storytelling. Inscryption, for me, is such a game. On a general sense, it has always seemed to me that the process of wrapping a story around the core gameplay loop of any game is a very hard thing to do, mainly because of the way that gameplay and the repetition that it inevitably entails can restrict or dictate the manner in which a story can unfold. This is probably why we have so many games that simply decide to outright avoid the whole issue by breaking up the experience into gameplay segments that are separate from story and exposition cutscenes or sequences. The most basic example of this structure is very straightforward. The game is comprised of levels where the gameplay takes place, and in between these levels we get story cutscenes with no gameplay at all. And this is by far my least favorite narrative structure commonly found in games precisely because it does nothing to employ the conventions of the medium in creative ways to tell a unique story. But the thing is that having a certain set of constraints when writing a story doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. All mediums of storytelling come with their own unique limitations. Good stories, however, can take those limitations and turn them into advantages. And so, my favorite kind of games are those that actually merge gameplay and storytelling in creative and surprising ways. Inscryption certainly accomplishes this, but even more than that, to me, Inscryption represents a whole new approach to thinking about the ways in which storytelling interacts with and exists inside the constraints afforded by a game's structure and gameplay loop. Inscryption shatters the conventions that have traditionally dictated the role that storytelling can and should occupy within the medium of games as a whole, and in doing so, Inscryption opens a door of new possibilities to explore when it comes to the relationship between story and gameplay. However, before I dive into Inscryption itself, I want to talk a little bit about story and gameplay first, and specifically about the relationship between these two. And I want to do so by taking a close look at a couple of other games, starting with a game that I think excels at bringing story and gameplay together in order to create a greater narrative experience: the action roguelike Hades.
Few tales are told of Hades, whose very name inspires fear and penitence, reminding us of the inevitable fate which we all share. I, however, mean to tell you such a tale. Listen carefully.
Goodbye, Father. To hell with this place.
Hades is a roguelike dungeon crawler that follows Zagreus, the son of the god of the underworld, as he attempts to escape from hell in order to search for his mother on the surface. Generally speaking, roguelike games tend to strongly prioritize gameplay over story. In fact, it's not uncommon to find that the sole purpose of a story in a roguelike game is to merely provide a premise so that the gameplay can happen. Because of this, the narrative in a roguelike game is usually built out of the emergent interactions of the gameplay itself rather than being conveyed through more traditional storytelling techniques. However, Hades stands out to me in this regard because it succeeds in blending both gameplay and storytelling in an organic way that adds up to a greater whole. Hades uses its gameplay mechanics, as well as the very conventions of the roguelike genre in general, to support and enhance its story. And, at the same time, the inverse is also true. Hades' storytelling informs and deepens the gameplay itself. In other words, story and gameplay in Hades constantly benefit and are enriched by each other, creating a narrative experience that goes beyond the scope of your usual roguelike game. I'd argue that, at its heart, Hades is a coming-of-age story of sorts, which at first glance might seem like an odd statement to make. Zagreus is, after all, depicted as a young adult visually, and he comes off as emotionally mature in a lot of his interactions with other characters. However, there are also other instances when we see Zagreus depicted in a very childlike way. At one point, we learn that Zagreus gets into arguments with his father because his room is always dirty. In another exchange, we see Hades and Nyx arguing heatedly, prompting Zagreus to say, "I hate it when they fight like that," a phrase that makes him sound almost like a child dealing with his parents' collapsing marriage. And lastly, we learn that Zagreus and Hades get into constant fights because Zagreus won't take his job as part of the household seriously, which ultimately ends in him being relieved of his position in the family business of managing the underworld. In other words, Zagreus comes off at times as a sulky, aimless teenager more than anything else, trapped in a broken home and lashing out by avoiding all of his responsibilities. Zagreus may not be a child, but his life in Hades is stuck in a childlike state. There is nothing at stake in anything that Zagreus does, no consequences for his actions, and he has no responsibilities or worries, as we can see by the fact that even getting fired from his job by his father doesn't really have any real impact on him at all. But his existence is also devoid of anything meaningful as well, and, perhaps even more importantly, he has no agency, his life being ruled by his father's desires. I mean, the whole premise behind the game's story is that Zagreus literally cannot leave his father's house without his permission. And so, the important thing to take from all of this is that the key quality that defines Zagreus as a character in the beginning of the story is that he is stuck, and he's stuck in more ways than one. Zagreus is stuck metaphorically in the sense that, as I just mentioned, his life is in a state of stagnation where nothing holds any kind of meaningful value. But he is also literally stuck, trapped as he is within the physical boundaries of Hades itself. And lastly, Zagreus' relationship with his father is also stuck, strained as it is by a lack of communication between them. And it is this theme or idea of being stuck that which lies at the heart of the story's drive. Hades begins with an ominous note. A narrator states that not many stories are told about Hades because these stories remind people of the ultimate fate that we all share. That is, death. This opening sets death as a theme in a rather somber way. However, once we start playing the game, we realize that because this is a video game and specifically a roguelike, death is actually not that big of a deal. At least not for our protagonist Zagreus, and certainly not for the player either. Dying is, after all, an essential and expected part of roguelikes in general. Zagreus' goal is to escape Hades. Dying prevents him from escaping, but after each death, Zagreus returns to his father's house and he can simply try escaping again. Death comes with no real penalty for him. Sure, the player loses everything they had accumulated during any given run upon death, but runs in Hades are not that long, and after every run, the player gets access to new permanent upgrades and unlocks that will make future runs easier. And so, there's actually not that much at stake in dying here, either gameplay or story-wise. Both Zagreus and the player can take as long as they need to fulfill their ultimate goal of escaping. Hades may take place in Hell itself, an underworld where souls are tortured for all eternity. And yet, for Zagreus, Hades is a static place where there is nothing at stake, nothing of meaning to be gained or lost, and ultimately, it is Zagreus' desire to escape from this place, a desire to get unstuck, that which becomes the main drive for him as a character. Well, that and finding his family. Family is the central theme of Hades, and yet all of the depictions of family that we see in the game are dysfunctional. Zagreus' father is emotionally distant and abusive. The relationship between Hades and Nyx is loveless. Even Zagreus' extended family, the Olympians, are far from being the perfect image of a healthy family. But perhaps more importantly, Zagreus' relationship with his father, which lies at the center of the game's story, has broken down completely. Family, for Zagreus, is just another way of being stuck in a place where nothing can grow or get better. All of this changes, however, when Nyx confesses to Zagreus that she is not actually his birth mother. After learning this, Zagreus' goal becomes to escape Hades and find his mother on the surface, to find something outside of what he knows, something that will have real meaning, a way to get unstuck, to finally move forward, to find a family he can belong to. And it is at this point that his worldview begins to shift. When Zagreus had nothing of value to look forward to, Hades itself was nothing but a static place where not even death held any real stake or consequence. But once Zagreus gains a goal that he believes is worth achieving, that is, finding his mother, Hades becomes an oppressive place, a prison keeping him from growing out of his hollow state. In other words, through the very act of his many escape attempts, we see Zagreus literally and metaphorically trying to outgrow the world around him as well as his own stagnant life. And as this is happening, we also see Zagreus' worldview mature as he develops a more complex understanding of himself, of his family, and of the world in general. And so, Zagreus' development as a character happens ultimately through the endless repetition that his many escape attempts entail. It is through this repetition that Zagreus' will and perseverance are tested, and it is through this repetition that Zagreus comes to learn that the world around him can be full of hardship, but also full of meaning, something that he had been missing throughout his whole life up to this point. This is the narrative arc of Hades, at least in my own personal interpretation of the story, and what I find fascinating about this game is that this narrative arc is supported and enhanced by the game mechanics as well as by the structure of the game itself. Hades is a roguelike and, as such, it employs many of the conventions of the genre, sometimes with creative twists to them that serve to complement the game's story in unique ways. The best example of this is perhaps Hades' implementation of permadeath. Like most roguelikes, Hades uses a form of permadeath. That is to say that every time the player dies, they lose everything that they had accumulated throughout the run and they go back to the beginning of the game. However, while the gameplay of Hades follows this rule, the game's story actually persists even after death. Zagreus, like the player, is aware of dying and of reviving back at his father's house after each run. This is a brilliant implementation of permadeath that serves to align Zagreus and the player in some interesting ways. Just as the player slowly learns the ins and outs of the game, so Zagreus grows with each run as a character. In other words, the permadeath structure in Hades serves two purposes. First, it upholds the core structure of the game of dying, going back to Hades' house, and then beginning another run. And second, it develops and expands Zagreus' character by letting the player experience his journey more intimately through the gameplay, which is to say that just as Zagreus is trying to outgrow the world around him, so is the player's resilience and will tested as they fight for their own worthy goal of beating the game. Another good example of the ways in which storytelling and gameplay merge in Hades is through the system of boons. Like most roguelikes, in Hades you acquire new skills and upgrades as you progress through each run. In Hades, these are called boons. However, boons are linked to the many gods of Olympus, who are trying to help Zagreus in his escape attempt by sending these gifts to him. Every time Zagreus collects one of these boons, he interacts with one of the gods of Olympus, and so boons serve both a gameplay purpose and a storytelling one as well. Boons are the tools that the player acquires to progress each run, but they also serve to further characterize Zagreus as well as a cast of secondary characters in order to expand on the game's central theme of family. Zagreus' interactions with the Olympians and with his own father throughout the game ultimately give him a more complex understanding of family than he had at the beginning. At first, the boons from the Olympians seem like a way to freedom, a way to escape his broken family and join another, better, healthier family. But the more he learns about the gods, the more he realizes just how dysfunctional the relationships between the Olympians really are, and with this comes the understanding that he and his father are trapped in a similar endless cycle of conflict. In these and many other ways, Hades brings together gameplay and narrative in unique and creative ways that manage to craft a story that could simply not exist in the same way in any other medium. Hades uses the very conventions of the roguelike genre with all of its inherent limitations and constraints and uses them to support and enrich the story. And yet, even with all of this, I can't help but notice the ways in which Hades' gameplay loop and structure ultimately do constrain the game's story in some key ways. For example, Zagreus can never actually escape from hell because the game can't take place anywhere else, and so the story must come up with a contrived reason to have him eventually return to Hades even after he finally manages to get out. Zagreus can also not interact with the Olympian gods in any way other than through the dialogue exchanges inherent to boons. Similarly, he can also not interact with his own father, Hades, in any way other than through their final boss encounter at the end of each run and the dialogue that takes place back at their house afterwards.
Stupid boy. I told you nobody gets out of here, whether alive or dead. So how was your wanton ransacking of my domain?
Greetings, Father. My ransacking was a delight, thank you for asking. So I'll just be on my way again.
Be on your way indeed. What do I care? You shall never reach the surface. Go, see for yourself.
And so, Zagreus can never interact with the world around him in any way other than through the central loop of fighting enemies until a room is cleared, grabbing a power-up, and then moving on to the next room. He can never interact with the gods of Olympus through anything other than dialogue boxes because doing so would require for the gods to have character models and animations. And Hades, as well as the other bosses in the game, can never have a change of heart because they need to keep preventing Zagreus from escaping so that the game can take place. Just as Zagreus is contained within the borders of Hades, the underworld, so is he trapped within the confines of Hades, the video game. But, as I said before, this is not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, I'd argue that Hades works so well precisely because these two sides of the same coin, gameplay and storytelling, support and expand each other to create a greater narrative experience. I said earlier that Zagreus can't interact with the world around him in any way other than through the central loop of fighting enemies and moving on to the next room, because that's how the gameplay needs to work. But if we look at the story side of things, we'll see that Zagreus cannot, in fact, express himself in any way other than through violence because communication with his father has broken down. The endless repetition of the gameplay loop comes to symbolize the feeling of oppression and monotony that has become the norm for Zagreus. Zagreus' life in Hades, and more specifically, Zagreus' relationship with his father, has become a never-ending cycle of conflict, one that Zagreus is not equipped to deal with, at least not yet. And so, the player's slow crawl towards getting better at the game and eventually beating it becomes a parallel to the slow development that Zagreus undergoes as he learns and grows and fights to escape the endless, meaningless cycle that his life has become. And yet, I still find it interesting that even in a game like Hades, we can see the ways in which the core gameplay loop and the overall structure of the game itself inevitably do end up straining the manner in which the story can unfold in some crucial ways. Roguelikes, even more so than other games, are built on the concept of repetition. The repetition inherent in the core gameplay of Hades can make it so that the player grows a bit too accustomed to the story's structure. We know that once we reach the Hades' boss fight, there will be a small dialogue between Zagreus and Hades that gives us a bit of exposition or character development, and then we'll die, and we'll get another dialogue, and then we'll talk to all the NPCs, and we'll do another run, and then we'll repeat that until the story is over. And so, fundamentally, we know that nothing that falls outside of this cycle can really take place in our experience with the game. It definitely feels to me like this is ultimately a very constricting structure for a story to organically unfold, one that no game seems to truly be able to escape, and I'd argue that this is one of the greatest limitations that the story of a game must cope with, the constraints afforded by the endless repetition of the gameplay loop, even if those constraints can end up working to positively impact the story sometimes, as is the case with Hades itself. And so it seems to me that game developers keep struggling with the inherent tensions and interactions that occur when gameplay and storytelling meet, especially when we're talking about AAA games with an emphasis on creating a story-driven experience and which also happen to have a big budget behind them. It has become a convention for AAA games to add a lot of secondary mechanics and side gimmicks that fall outside of the central gameplay loop in order to break up the repetition and provide a greater sense of gameplay variety for the player. But at best, these gimmicks and side activities tend to feel like unnecessary fluff that can even detract from the core experience of the game, and at worst, they can make the game feel unpolished or just plain tedious. Another common technique that I see employed often in an attempt to mitigate the repetition afforded by the gameplay is when a game takes away a central mechanic from the player in order to switch things up. For example, the main character might get injured and they can no longer fight enemies anymore, so they are forced to hide from them instead. Or how about when a game tries to break up gameplay segments with action set pieces that contain some form of minigame or a simplified version of the gameplay? But just like with the previous example, these techniques more often than not feel gimmicky and carry the risk of making the game feel tedious and frustrating more than anything else. This is obviously not to say that it is impossible to manage gameplay and story successfully, as Hades itself proves. And yet, even though the story and gameplay of Hades complement each other so well, I'd argue that in the end, Hades has become the massive success that it is precisely because it places an emphasis on its brilliantly designed and masterfully polished gameplay to drive the experience as a whole. In other words, I think that it's fair to say that, ultimately, Hades does emphasize gameplay over story. While it's true that the story is supported and enhanced by the gameplay, it is the gameplay itself that which lies at the core of the experience, and therefore, the story must inevitably bend to the necessities of the gameplay and not the other way around. The point that I'm trying to make with all of this is that, in the end, it appears to me that trying to tell a story within the constraints that a video game affords means having to manage a constant tug-of-war between gameplay and storytelling. Every time you emphasize one of them, the other becomes more strained and limited. And ultimately, there is a good reason for this. Making games takes a lot of money, time, and effort. From animating every little detail, to voice acting, to creating everything from the game art to the menus, to designing levels and enemies, to creating and polishing a good gameplay loop, not to mention the programming and coding and everything that those entail. Making a game is an arduous, all-consuming task, and as such, there is only so much content that a developer can pack into any given game. And because not even AAA developers have an endless number of resources, let alone indie developers sometimes comprised of only a handful of people, it seems like the best thing that anyone can do for a game is to focus on polishing the core gameplay experience first, and then find a way to make the story work within its scope. In the end, there's not really much else that developers can do, right? As I said before, making good games is extremely expensive and time-consuming, and so it's not like game developers can simply decide to have the game transform into something completely new and different halfway through just because it fits the story, right? I mean, right? Now, before I get into discussing Inscryption, I first want to give a summary of my brief history with card games. When I was younger, the only card game that I played enough to have at least a decent understanding of was Magic the Gathering. But my group of friends and I always played in the constructed format. In this format, you make a deck prior to playing the game, using any of the legal cards that you own. The cool thing about this format is that if you're playing at a high level, you can really optimize your deck to the fullest, as long as you own the cards that you need for it. And on the more casual level, it allows you to create a deck that fits your personality and gameplay style. On the other hand, the biggest problem that this format has, at least in my personal experience with it, is that it can get very monotonous after a while, especially if you only have a small group of friends that you play regularly with. And sometimes it can even get straight up annoying if you happen to have that one friend in your group who's super competitive and is always trying to build their deck specifically to counter every single one of your cards. Either way, and for a really long time, this was the only way I knew how to play Magic. It was not until several years later, and with a new group of friends, that I participated in my first draft ever. In the draft format of Magic the Gathering, you must build your deck out of cards that you get from sealed booster packs that you open on the spot. The interesting thing about this format is that it essentially incorporates the skill of deck building into the game itself by forcing you to create a deck out of a group of random cards. And what I love the most about that first draft that I ever participated in was the way in which it allowed me to experience a game that I thought I knew in a manner that felt completely different. Playing a draft made me consider the mechanics and systems that Magic the Gathering is built upon in new and refreshing ways. In a draft, individual cards have a different value than they do in the constructed format, and you must consider the various deck archetypes in a different way as well. Perhaps most obviously, you must also reframe the very way you approach the process of deck building. Rather than placing an emphasis on optimization, a draft challenges you to be malleable in your approach. Instead of having a preconceived notion of the deck you want to make, you must be ready to adapt to the cards that you get as you open your booster packs. What I appreciated the most about that very first draft that I ever played was the ways in which it forced me to recontextualize my understanding of the very mechanics, systems, and other elements that comprised Magic the Gathering. And in a greater sense, I think that this is the very idea that is built into the core of the draft format in general. In the constructed format, it pays to learn what the best options available to you are, and then after that, it's a matter of trying to get as consistent as possible at performing those options over and over. But in contrast, every draft that you play is different, so what worked for you last time might not be available to you this time. And so, every draft requires that you undergo that process of having to reframe your thinking of the game based on the options that are presented to you. And this is why, to this day, I think that the draft format is the most fun way to play Magic, at least for me personally. Now, besides Magic the Gathering, the only other card game that I've played a significant amount of time is Slay the Spire, a roguelike game that beautifully combines card-based combat with the structure of a dungeon crawler. There's not much going on in terms of story in Slay the Spire. However, if we're talking about gameplay, then I can say that Slay the Spire is a game that absolutely mesmerizes me. This is a game that is built upon a complex intertwining of systems and mechanics that create a very rich depth to the gameplay. At first, what Slay the Spire did for me was scratch that itch that I was left with after experiencing my first few drafts of Magic the Gathering. In a way, Slay the Spire works kind of like a draft of Magic in that you must build your deck as you go out of the random cards that you get during any given run. I think this is why the structure of roguelikes in general is such a perfect fit to Slay the Spire's card-based gameplay. I mean, the draft format is in itself kind of like the roguelike version of Magic the Gathering if you think about it. But the thing about Slay the Spire is that it is an extremely difficult and unforgiving game. Winning a run in the base game of Slay the Spire is not that hard, relatively speaking, but once you start trying to take on the true final boss of the game, the heart of the Spire itself, and even beyond that, once you start tackling the Ascension mode, in which you keep unlocking levels of escalating difficulty, the game demands that you truly delve into and master the tangle of systems and mechanics that it is built upon. But this is also when the complexity of the game truly begins to open up, and I think that to truly master the Spire, the most important thing you must do is learn how to become flexible in the way in which you perceive and approach the game. In other words, you must be able to constantly recontextualize your understanding of how the game works. When I first began attempting to beat the heart and reach the true ending, the game turned into a kind of puzzle for me. I became obsessed with the idea of solving the puzzle of how to win the game. And yet, every time that I thought I was beginning to really understand how the game worked, I would get stuck. Even though I had a strong deck, I would die to the late game over and over. And so, I realized that in order to win, I was going to need to start thinking about the inherent mechanics of the game in new and different ways. Like I said, this game is built upon a complex tangle of systems and mechanics. The most obvious one is the cards themselves. I began to try combinations of cards that I'd never tried before, but on top of this, you also have to manage the other myriad elements of the game and the dizzying ways in which they all interact with each other. I began asking myself questions like, when should I be taking elite fights? When should I use my one-time potions? What's the best path to take through each act in any given situation? In Slay the Spire, you are constantly faced with choices built around the idea of risk and reward, and even the smallest decision can have big repercussions later on. You must manage your resources. You must always be thinking both on the micro level of each fight as well as on the macro level of each entire act. You must weigh every choice, and you must be willing to keep an open and flexible mind that will allow you to adapt to the opportunities that are presented to you during any given run. Slay the Spire is, after all, a roguelike, which means that the resources and options available to you will change significantly each run. But even among most roguelikes, Slay the Spire stands out to me in just how drastically different each run of the game can be. What I find interesting about this level of randomness is that it essentially forces you to reassess what you think you know about the game every time you play it. You must learn to look at the game holistically and be able to constantly find new and creative ways to make progress that you hadn't considered before. For example, when I first started to play as the Silent, it became immediately obvious to me what her two biggest deck archetypes are, Shifts and Poison. If you get lucky and find the correct group of cards during a run, you can create a really powerful deck that leans into one of these two archetypes. However, I also quickly realized that during many runs, I wasn't able to get either of these two archetypes going at all. And so I learned that I needed to find new creative ways to use Shiv and Poison cards, and I needed to find other ways in which the Silent could win. I needed to learn how to use one-time potions and relics better to get me out of tough situations, and I needed to get better at managing my most precious resource, my character's health. In other words, I needed to learn to appreciate the game and all of its intertwining systems as a cohesive whole. Now, another interesting thing to consider about Slay the Spire's design and the way in which all of its elements are integrated seamlessly into a greater whole is the fact that all of the enemy encounters in the game are built as checks. Each encounter provides a unique challenge or check that you must be able to overcome with your current deck. But because every run in Slay the Spire is dramatically different, you must have a greater understanding of the game as a whole in order to be able to clear these checks in a variety of different ways, depending on whatever resources you happen to hold at the time, which include not only your cards, but also your potions, your relics, and your current amount of health. Once again, we see that at the center of the game lies this idea that the most important skill that a player can have is the ability to be malleable and adapt to the options presented to them during any given run. And perhaps no enemy encounter represents this so well as the true final boss of the game, the corrupt heart of the Spire itself. If I'm being honest, I kind of hated the fight against the heart at first simply because of how arbitrarily difficult it felt to me. From the overwhelming amount of damage that the heart casually throws at you, to forcing you to take damage every time you play a card, to dealing with a bunch of negative statuses on your character and extra cards added to your deck, it felt like I needed to learn how to break the game just to beat it. But now, I think that the heart very elegantly encapsulates the overall design of Slay the Spire. Mere luck and cheesy strats will not be enough for you to kill the heart of the Spire. To accomplish this, you will need to understand how the game works on a greater level. Every card that you take, every point of health that you lose, every enemy you fight, every potion you get, every single decision that you make matters. The only way you can beat the heart is if you were able to prepare for that final check throughout the course of your entire run. In this way, you can say that the final boss of Slay the Spire is not the heart itself, but what the heart represents, the Spire as a whole. In other words, the ultimate challenge of the game is to master not just the fight against the heart, but rather the whole run that leads up to it. In order to slay the heart of the Spire, you must master the Spire itself. That is to say, you must master the complex and mesmerizing ways in which the mechanics of the game interact with each other. You need to learn how to be malleable and adapt to whatever resources you get during your run, and you must be able to build your deck to deal with immediate threats even as you prepare for the steep challenges of the late game. In this way, the final fight against the heart beautifully symbolizes the game's overall design approach, and this is perhaps most evident in the 3 keys that unlock the final door to the heart itself. In order to gain access to the final act of the game and the heart itself, you must collect 3 keys during your run and beat the bosses of the 3rd act. You must recall the red key at a campfire. You must collect the blue key out of a chest, and you must win the green key by fighting against a buffed elite combat. These 3 requirements don't seem like that big of a deal at first, but they test your knowledge of the game in key ways. Recalling the red key means you must forfeit a chance to rest or to upgrade one of your cards, which is a pretty big deal in a game where card upgrades are preciously limited and you can end up losing a ton of health in the blink of an eye. Collecting the blue key means having to sacrifice one of the 3 guaranteed relics that you can get during your run. And lastly, having to fight a buffed elite for the green key can be deadly if you are not properly equipped to take it on. Collecting the 3 keys strains your already limited resources, but because you can grab the keys at any time during your run, they also test your knowledge of the game. It's up to you to figure out when you're ready to take on the buffed elite fight. It's up to you to decide what chest relic you'll have to pass on, and it's up to you to choose the campfire that you'll spend to recall the red key. The optimal time to collect each key will differ dramatically depending on the run. Beating the 3rd act can be difficult enough as it is, but to reach the heart you must also collect the 3 keys even as you prepare for the final set of checks that the heart brings with itself. And so, in order to beat the heart, you must have a greater understanding of the many moving parts that comprise the Spire as a whole. The heart will test you on every aspect of the game. You'll need to be able to deal, as well as block, high amounts of damage consistently. You'll need to deal with negative statuses and with having to take damage with every card that you play. You'll need to be able to endure a long fight that can't be cheesed with an infinite combo. And because even getting to the heart requires that you collect the 3 keys, you'll also need to have a greater understanding of the game as a whole as you navigate the Spire itself. This is why I've grown to really appreciate the ways in which the heart brilliantly represents the ideas that lie at the core of the game's design, which is fitting enough seeing as the heart itself is a clear symbol of the organ that pumps blood throughout the whole body of the Spire, the thing that keeps it alive. Slay the Spire teaches you that every run requires you to adapt to the conditions presented to you at any given time, even if that means having to rethink a strategy or knowledge that you have come to rely upon. In this way, Slay the Spire prevents you from becoming too comfortable with your knowledge of the game, even as it constantly pushes you to explore further and further into the game's mechanics and systems. And it is precisely because of all of this that I think that playing Slay the Spire has actually made me better at playing games in general. And so, I'd argue that Slay the Spire is built upon the very idea of being able to repeatedly reframe and recontextualize your understanding of the game. And for me, coming from a game like Magic the Gathering, this meant I had to unlearn a lot of the things that I had internalized about card games. Slay the Spire is a game that taught me how to look at a game's mechanics and systems, and be flexible in the way in which I approach and engage with them. It is a game that taught me to avoid becoming too comfortable with the preconceptions that I developed about the way a game works. And finally, Slay the Spire is a game that taught me that I should never become too complacent in my knowledge of a game's rules and mechanics, because doing so can be fatal. Now, the reason I've spent so much time describing and analyzing all of these ideas present in Hades and Slay the Spire is because I think that Inscryption is not only a game that seems to be built with similar concepts in mind, but it also takes them into a whole new level. I mentioned at the beginning of this video that Inscryption is a game with many layers to it. On the simplest level, you can say that Inscryption is a card game, and yet if you've played through this game, then you know that it is also so much more. Inscryption is a roguelike deck building game. It is an escape room puzzle game. It is a psychological horror found footage film. It is a retro game. It is a story-driven experience with meta-narrative elements that blur the lines between fiction and reality. But in another way, to me, Inscryption also represents a new way of thinking about the very conventions of the medium of games as a whole, particularly as it relates to the question of how gameplay and story can interact with each other to create a greater narrative experience. One of the things that I find most fascinating about Inscryption is that this is a game that keeps changing the rules on you, forcing you to adapt and to rethink or reframe your understanding of the gameplay. And not only that, but the reason Inscryption truly stands out to me so much among many of the games that I've played in recent years is because this notion of changing the established rules of the game happens also on the level of the storytelling itself, creating an experience unlike any that I had seen prior to playing through this game. Inscryption is divided into sections that I will refer to as acts in here. Act 1 takes place inside Leshy's cabin, where you find yourself seemingly kidnapped by a mysterious and unhinged figure who forces you to play their creepy handmade card game and where losing means death. The card game itself has roguelike dungeon crawling elements very clearly inspired by Slay the Spire. However, pretty soon into Act 1, the first paradigm shift of the game happens when some of the cards begin talking to you, hinting at the fact that there is a lot more going on in this game than what you can see on the surface. Along with the discovery of these sentient cards, the player also gains the ability to get up from the table and start exploring the cabin in which they're trapped. Leshy's card game then becomes only one piece in a larger game that involves solving escape room type puzzles as you slowly lay down a plan to outsmart Leshy and escape with the help of your new card friends. In order for this plan to succeed, however, you must indeed beat Leshy at his own card game in the end. The only way to escape from the cabin is to ultimately win a run of Leshy's card game, and to accomplish this, you must play the game over and over again. You must learn its systems and mechanics. You must find out what the best cards and tools and items are. In other words, you must learn to master the card game in order to build a deck that will be strong enough to defeat Leshy. You know, like you do in any other game. But then, something fascinating happens. Once you finally manage to beat the game, that is to say, once you manage to become skilled enough at the game to defeat Leshy, who serves as the final boss, the second shift of the game happens. The player unlocks the new game button and they gain access to the original version of Inscryption, which is also known as the second act of the game. Act 2 of Inscryption is probably the most overwhelming part of the game in terms of the gameplay, mainly because the rules of the game suddenly change on you right after you had managed to get good enough at Leshy's version of the game. But this is also the most jarring shift that you experience in general. The game changes from the 3D visuals of Leshy's cabin into a retro-style game with pixel graphics. The terrifying Leshy, along with the 3 sentient cards, become the 4 scribes as the story of the game rearranges itself into something entirely new. And amidst all of this, the player also uncovers some found footage of a fictional content creator named Luke Carter, who is played by a real person, that is to say, a real human actor, as opposed to a polygonal or pixelated character. And so, even as the rules of the game change drastically for the player, the overall story of the game collapses and then expands to reveal several layers that overlap each other, from Leshy's cabin to a new retro game to footage of a fictional character played by a real actor. In other words, the player is suddenly forced to recontextualize their understanding of both the rules of the game they've been playing, but also of the overall narrative of the game itself. One of the biggest differences in gameplay of Act 2 is that you now have a permanent deck you can edit by swapping cards that you can collect from booster packs found throughout the world. Essentially, the game transforms into something new, going from a Slay the Spire style roguelike to an adventure game with a rule set more akin to the constructed format of Magic the Gathering, in which you must build your deck out of the cards that you own. There are also no more one-time use items, and you can't modify your individual cards anymore. Finally, there are a couple of new core game mechanics added to the game as well, which is actually one of the things that most fascinate me about this section of the game. You see, in Act 2, the game now has 4 different core mechanics that allow the player to bring cards into play, which is something that I definitely never experienced in any card game before. Magic the Gathering has the system of mana as its main way to play cards. Slay the Spire has energy. Other games have things like monster sacrifice. But in Act 2 of Inscryption, you suddenly find yourself having to juggle 4 different core mechanics. The first 2 are ones that the player is already familiar with. sacrificing creatures for blood, and using bones obtained from cards that have died. But on top of this, there are two new systems: consuming energy to play cards and using magical gems to summon creatures. Ultimately, the reason all of these systems work well is because of the way in which they overlap with each other. Using gems and energy to play cards opens up ways to sacrifice creatures for blood, which in turn rewards you with bones. Now, all card games have alternative ways to bring cards into play, but Inscryption stands out to me because all of its four main systems are built into the foundation of the game. None of them can really be said to be the one core system. And yet, it is precisely because of this that the game's four mechanics also have a sense of dissonance in relation to each other, almost like they are constantly at odds with one another. Rather than the game feeling like a cohesive whole, it feels more like there are four different card games all mashed into one, each core system vying against the other, which, of course, is actually exactly what is happening. Each of the game's four mechanics was created by one of the scribes. Each scribe has essentially designed their own card game, and just as the four scribes are always in conflict with each other, all of them trying to take control of Inscryption, the overall card game itself is plagued by conflicting and overlapping sets of mechanics and rules. But the truly fascinating aspect of this section of the game is that the player is left to parse all of this information by themselves as they play through Act 2. In more ways than one, jumping from Leshy's version of the game and into the original version of Inscryption makes it feel as though the game as a whole is shifting right under your feet. Where Leshy's game felt like a very cohesive experience, the original version of Inscryption feels like a chaotic mess that's constantly in flux. In this way, Act 2 forces the player to recontextualize their understanding of the gameplay by having to deal with new mechanics while, at the same time, they are trying to adapt to the sudden changes in the rules. But on top of this, the player is now also having to juggle several overlapping layers of narrative. The new story involving the four scribes, video game characters who have gained consciousness, the mystery of something called the Old Data, the horror found footage film with Luke Carter, a backstory involving the developers of Inscryption themselves and a sinister video game company, a doomsday device, and a meta-narrative that blurs the lines between fiction and real life. And then, just as the player is once again beginning to get to grips with this new version of the game, yet another shift occurs at the end of Act 2. Act 3 begins after PO3 takes over the original Inscryption and, much like Leshy before him, transforms it into a whole new game built in his own image. Act 3 changes the game's rules on the player once again, revisiting and reimagining elements from both of the previous acts, and, once again, the player is left to relearn and adapt to the changing rules before them in order to keep going. Act 3 echoes Leshy's cabin in Act 1, at least in some respects, but there are many key differences to the rules and mechanics. PO3's game is not a roguelike with permadeath. Instead, the player must explore 4 areas in order to beat 4 bosses, all of them echoes of the 4 scribes in the previous version of the game. While there are no card packs to find, as was the case in Act 2, the player's cards remain with them even after death, but, much like in Act 1, the player can modify or enhance those cards. Also, one-time use items are back, but they are regenerated at checkpoints, which means that the player can be much more liberal in their usage. The main mechanic to play cards now is energy, which is fundamentally different to Leshy's system of blood and bones. In Leshy's cabin, the player quickly learns that the best strategy is to simply end each fight before the opponent can even do anything. In PO3's version of the game, however, this is not really a possibility. Energy grows exponentially each turn, but it starts very low. This means that early turns are hard, but later turns become easier as the player can bring more powerful cards to the board. And this is why I just find Inscryption so fascinating. The way in which it forces you to adapt to an ever-changing set of rules, to learn and relearn the different versions of the game as you make your way through each act. And I love how the different layers of storytelling are laced throughout the whole experience, teasing you with the many mysteries that are seemingly hiding away behind every little corner of the game. Now, after beating Act 3, the game shifts once again into a story-driven final act that brings the game to a conclusion. Not much happens in terms of gameplay during this final act, but we do get to see the resolution to some of the storylines and mysteries, even as we are left with more questions about the world of the game and its characters. And so, it is because of all of these things that I find Inscryption to be a fascinating experience. Inscryption is a game that is built on the idea of constantly changing the rules of the game on you, forcing you to relearn the game, to recontextualize your understanding of it over and over, not only in terms of the gameplay, but also on the level of storytelling as well. And in a greater sense, I think that the structure of Inscryption, as well as the concepts that it is built upon, give us a glimpse into the untapped potential that still remains to be explored when it comes to finding new ways in which gameplay and storytelling can interact within the context of games as a narrative medium. If this was any other game, you'd simply keep on replaying the core gameplay loop over and over, and the story would unfold within the context of this loop. But Inscryption changes the rules of the game and the game as a whole multiple times right before your eyes, shattering, in the process, any preconceptions you might have had about how a story can unfold within the confines of the game. Every time Inscryption changes in front of you, it feels like a door of new possibilities is kicked wide open, as you don't really know what to expect anymore. And this is something that I don't think I had experienced before in any game, at least not in the way in which Inscryption pulls it off. And, to be clear, when Inscryption moves into a new act and changes up the game, it's not like it's actually becoming something entirely new. If we look at these shifts objectively, we can see that it's more like we're only getting different versions of the same game, much like going from playing Magic the Gathering in the constructed format to doing a draft for the first time. But Inscryption's shifts work so well because they feel like the whole game is transforming into something new right in front of you. Changing the visual aspect of the graphics, as well as modifying the rules and mechanics of the game, is a part of it. But also, I think that the story of the game itself has a big role to play in this regard. You see, as you delve deeper into the gameplay of Inscryption, you also begin to peel off more and more layers of the game's story, which expands from Leshy's card game to Leshy's cabin, then growing to encompass Luke Carter's parallel mystery just before the game changes entirely into the original Inscryption, which only adds more levels to the overall story. Act 2 and 3 keep on expanding and adding layers to the already perplexing nature of the game's overarching narrative, which itself grows to even encompass the real world through an ARG that occurred early during the game's life. This means that, far from experiencing a story within the restricted and visible boundaries of a game's traditional structure and gameplay loop, Inscryption's story seems to be alive, collapsing before your very eyes and transforming into something entirely new over and over. Just as the game keeps changing the rules on you, forcing you to adapt and reframe the way you approach the gameplay, so does the game's story expand vertically, stacking new layers of storytelling that force you to recontextualize your understanding of the game as a whole and adding to that larger feel that the game keeps on changing into something completely different. Still, it's not like Inscryption is perfect. I'd argue that the game's biggest flaw is that the balance and depth of the gameplay itself suffer because of the emphasis on storytelling that the game has. In my first casual playthrough, the game just felt way too easy to beat. Now, I don't think that every game needs to be incredibly difficult to be successful, but I do think that Inscryption in particular would have benefited from being a bit more challenging. The very idea at the center of the game is that the rules keep changing on the player, forcing them to adapt to the new conditions. But if the game is too easy, then there's not much that the player actually needs to do in order to go through that process of relearning and adapting to the new rules of the game. Ultimately, I think that Inscryption emphasizes storytelling at the cost of a more polished gameplay, and I think that I understand why the developers would choose to go in this direction. Inscryption is, in the end, a very story-driven game with a wider intended audience in mind. And so, if a player were to get stuck in Leshy's cabin for, say, over 40 hours because they don't have a lot of experience with card games, it would really kill the pacing of the overall story. In this sense, Inscryption is the opposite of a game like Slay the Spire. Slay the Spire is a PO3 type of game. In emphasizing gameplay over storytelling, Slay the Spire provides an incredibly complex and deep gameplay experience at the cost of sacrificing a richer, more layered story. The quote-unquote story in Slay the Spire happens more through the emergent interactions between the game's mechanics themselves, each run of the game having a kind of storytelling arc of its own, built out of nothing but the gameplay itself. Inscryption, on the other hand, is more of a Leshy's kind of game. A game that cares more about the lore and story than an excruciatingly polished gameplay experience. And in the end, I love that we have both of these kinds of games. I love that there is a variety in the ways in which games in general blend gameplay and storytelling in unique and creative ways, whether they prioritize gameplay over story or the other way around. But ultimately, Inscryption stands out to me so much because it provides an overall experience that I don't think I've seen any other game even come close to recreating. And I think that there is a lot of potential to the way in which Inscryption leads the player to believe that the very game itself changes into something entirely new. A process that transcends the established conventions of how storytelling is supposed to even exist within the medium of video games in general, where the gameplay so often tends to dictate and drive the narrative experience as a whole. As Inscryption changes the rules of the game on you, so does its story begin to expand, transcending not only the player's understanding of the gameplay loop, but going as far as to tear down the barrier between fiction and reality. The more I delved into Inscryption, the more I became obsessed with its mysteries, its characters, its secrets, a journey that echoes the very story of Luke Carter himself as he plays through his own fictional version of Inscryption. Echoes upon echoes, layers upon layers of narrative and story, Inscryption blows the door wide open in terms of the potential that still remains untapped as to the ways in which video games can bring gameplay and storytelling together in unique and creative ways to craft stories that could simply not exist in any other medium. And it accomplishes this by constantly changing the rules of the game on you, by making you wrap your head around ever-expanding layers of storytelling, by making you wonder where the game begins and where it ends, and by making you question the very idea of what it even means to play a game in the first place.